Why is it that, whether it's human nature, that we all make decisions, or there's this perceived risk in which you make decisions based on?
Well, I think the first point is that we are humans and not machines, because the amount of information or data that you encounter, that you are exposed to as a human, you take that in, you dissect it and you digest it, but not in a perfect sense that a machine or an algorithm will do in dissecting it and making the pros and cons and assessing the validity of that information in making the decisions. So as humans, you take snippets of that information, and that then influence how you behave and how you make those decisions in the end of the day.
Okay, which makes a lot of sense. And if we just jump in a little bit to maybe the psyche, some of the way it's described as availability heuristics or recency bias. How does that also now really start to cloud our judgment in terms of the type of decisions that you make?
Yeah, I mean, I as an actuary who works with numbers every day, it's easier to say that obviously you look at the numbers, you look at the data, you dissect it, it's clear, black and white, and then you can make decisions upon that. But the reality is that, as you say, the recency bias, the amount of information that you're recently exposed to, or the quantum and the type of information you've recently been exposed to, has a huge influence in you. So what you see, what you hear, influences your perception of reality.
Basically saying out of sight, out of mind, and that's what we're basing a lot of our decisions on.
Yeah, and the reality is that whatever you see, whatever you hear, be it friends, formal media, and more especially social media, as you go on the roads, in the office, at work, wherever you are, whatever information that you expose to, that's the recency bias. And then the type and the quantum of the information both work hand in hand in influencing then how you behave and how you take that in and make those decisions ultimately.
A case in point is probably the pandemic, where a lot of us, made decisions on what you could see, but often potentially to the detriment of our real life risks that we're actually facing.
Yeah, I think the pandemic is quite an interesting one because it's a play between the information and data available, but also the real risks that were underlying the lives during the pandemic. Now, we all know, we all had a new way of life in terms of the masks and the washing of hands and social distancing when it came to COVID. That was essential, it was important in curbing the spread of COVID-19. But if you actually look at the real data in South Africa in 2020, look at the death data. COVID-19, yes, was the highest cause of deaths in 2020, but not by far compared to diabetes, which was a second cause. And you look at other conditions like TB and HIV, they're still persistently high in South Africa. Those are infection-related conditions. So all of those are still pretty much high in South Africa, even post-COVID, but you never hear anyone saying, I need to be conscious about eating healthy and exercising well to curb diabetes, which we should, as much as we did with the masks and social distancing and washing of hands when it came to COVID, because the risk is still the same. You're still standing pretty much the same chances of dying to diabetes as you did with COVID.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, we're talking obviously the health type decisions that you make based on what's right in front of you. But this also plays out when you're making investment decisions, this recency bias. Just thinking, some of the stories that I've heard, it's like if you look at the US market, they were saying the last 10 years, it's probably given you 8% if you invest in the market. But on average, investors have only made 4.5% or 4.6%, which is almost half.
Again, biggest influence there, US and all over the globe, it's a human behavior. The investment, the markets are running. You going in fast, but you're going in at the bad timing when they already have ran. And when they tank or there's a decline in the market, in the stock markets, for whatever reason, then you flee the market actually at the bad time to be selling. So there's always that behavior that is counterintuitive to what a rational investor should be. But again, that is influenced by the information. You're seeing the market, you're seeing the news, you're seeing what's happening out there, and then you're making an optimal decision when it comes to your investments. And again, there's also another part I think that we need to be cognizant of when it comes to investments. Investment on its own and its returns, for me, is not as meaningful unless you peg it to your objective. If I were to ask you, if the stock market in South Africa, if your investment, let's say it's an equity fund in South Africa, gives you a 10%, would you be happy or not?
I'm going to give you an answer and say it depends.
Exactly. It does depend, because if in it absolute, it doesn't mean anything. But if the stock market, the JSE, had returned 30%, you're probably not going to be as happy. But the reality is, if your objective was to beat inflation is 4%, so now you've got 6% more than inflation, and your long-term goal is to beat inflation, then you should actually be happy. That's why I'm saying you always have to link it back to your long-term objectives and goals. And then what happens out there in the market, there's a lot that always going to be happening every day. That should not influence how then you decide whether you should stay or not in that equity fund. And when it comes to Africa, we see a lot of people. I mean, more than 75% of insurance taken out in South Africa is for death benefits, purely because death is visible. While actually the biggest risk that people face, if you look at all these conditions, and in South Africa, if you add diabetes on top of that, then the living benefits like severe illness or dread disease, which only contribute 25% of the market in South Africa, should actually be way more than people are taking. So people are using the data that are available to them to make the decision in how they purchase insurance, and that's really not a rational decision. Again, how we assess that information is influenced and impacted by the recency bias and the type and the quantum of the data we see.
So, I mean, essentially, if you're saying this is all human nature, how does one start avoiding these biases and making decisions, especially like we're talking about health and investments? What can one do to at least make sure that their plan is rational?
Well, first, it's difficult to be rational as a human because you've got emotions that sometimes come into play. But I think for me, it's always making sure that you've got the right checks and balances to help and support and assist you as a human being. And as someone who's got long-term goals, just get something that will always anchor you into those long-term goals, then everything else has to evolve around that. Because if you're going to have your goals evolving around what's happening out there, that becomes difficult. And to do that, one of the easiest ways is obviously to speak to an objective person, could be a financial advisor, someone who's an expert. Other ones would be really to keep reviewing your things like your budgets, keep reviewing your policies if you've got insurance, keep reviewing your investment goals, but not too frequent, because then you're going to be influenced by what's happening in the market. Put yourself objective once, twice a year. That could potentially be a much more appropriate way of how you go about it.
So essentially, anchor yourself, long-term view, and actually stick to the course. Stay the course.
Stay the course.
All right. So I know you love your numbers and spreadsheets, but what are some of the interesting stats that are actually worth sharing?
So recently, one of the fascinating stats I recently saw, which I mean, I have always knew this, but I mean, it rang a bell quite more close when I was thinking about this discussion. When it comes to cancer, in South Africa, 6 out of 10 people survive a cancer. And in more developed economies like the US, it's 7 out of 10. So that basically means you're more likely to survive a cancer than to die of it. But the opposite is actually true to how people behave. People are taking more life cover than they do severe illness. So again, that's where the actual information that is showing where the risks are is not coming through in terms of how people decide. People are holding 75% income death benefit or life cover instead of having severe illness because of the 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 people surviving the cancer.
Listen, thank you very much. I don't know if you've got any last wise words to share with our viewers.
Yeah, I think it's always wise to speak to a credible experts, and there's a lot of the stuff happening in social media. Speak to someone who's credible, objective, independent, and ensure that you stick to your long-term goal. It's plain boring, but it works.
Qualifications, experience, all those things come into it in terms of finding the right partner.
100%.
Thank you once again, Essen.
Thanks, Tabiso.